This is Andrew Connell with Critical Path Training, and in this session we're going to talk about the service architectural and logical overview of the new service architecture that we have inside of SharePoint 2010. Before we go through and we talk about this new service architecture in SharePoint 2010, the first thing we need to do is look at how the 2007 architecture worked with shared service providers and understand what some of the challenges were and how the new architecture is going to address those challenges. So, shared service providers were a big improvement over the previous version of SharePoint in SharePoint Server 2007. One of the things that it was really nice because we were able to go through and have certain configurations that all web applications could go through and leverage, or it could create a different configuration that a different web application leveraged. However, there were some downsides with this approach. First of all, in shared service providers was really an all or nothing proposition, whereas in a shared service provider, you would define the profile information, the audience information, BDC information for BDC catalogs, BDC applications, Excel services, and then also the search configuration. The challenge with this is that if I set all that stuff up, and let's say I had one SSP that had all those things configured, and I had web applications that were leveraging it, and they were all sharing the same search configuration. Let's say that I had a new application I wanted to create that wanted to use the same search implementation, but I had a different requirement for Excel services or BDC. My only option was to create a second SSP and duplicate all the stuff that I did with search in both of them. But then that's two things I have to maintain because there's nothing that really goes along with each piece. They're all completely individual, right? So that was one of the challenges that I had to deal with. Another thing is that developers did not have a way to very easily go through and create custom SSPs. You got people, or you got the user profile stuff, you got audiences, you got Excel services, business data catalog, and search, and that was it. You couldn't go through and create your own. Again, I already mentioned the web apps were tied to specific SSPs. And then the other thing that we had here was that SSPs, while technically we could go through and share them across farms, it wasn't a very easy thing to do. And so what we ended up doing was we could go set it up, but it was challenging to get working the exact way and to maintain it. So Microsoft looked at this all the challenges that we had with SSPs, and they essentially just took a sledgehammer to the architecture and then shattered it and broke it into a bunch of different pieces. And what we have now are things are not tied to SSPs. We now broke up those different things into individual services. So we have a search service now, we have a profile service, we have a people service, which is going to do our audiences and profiles. We have an Excel services one for BDC, all of that stuff. So they're all broken up into a bunch of different pieces here. This is going to be a much more flexible architecture because then when I go and create a new web application, I can say, go use the default services that have all been configured where we create these groups. And you can think of a group as kind of like how we used to think about an SSP, but I can mix and match things inside my group. So I can say either use all the stuff that's in the group, that's in the default group, or let me create a custom group. And all that basically says is, let me go pick a la carte which services I want to use in my web application. So I could use the same search that everybody else is using, but then have my own BDC service that I want to leverage as well. So I don't have to have multiple pieces here. One of the cool capabilities about this is that it's baked in at the core of SharePoint. It's part of the Microsoft SharePoint Foundation, so part of at the very core. Now there's no services that are really there for us to leverage in the core SharePoint Foundation. The SharePoint Server 2010 is what's going to give us a bunch of services out of the box. But the point here is that when we move on to talking more about how to create custom services, you can see that you can create your own custom ones just with Microsoft SharePoint Foundation. You don't have to have SharePoint Server. Okay. We're also going to be able to very easily share these services across farms because you'll see that how this is going to be set up when we talk about the components in a few minutes. You have the service, which is the main thing that's going to run, and then you're going to have this thing called a proxy. The proxy knows how to talk to the service and where the service is running. You then have these things called consumers, which are the things that are going to actually leverage the service, the things that are going to run the queries for search, or the things that are going to leverage the calculations inside of Excel services. There's an abstraction layer between where the service runs and where you're actually going to be using it. And that's being done with this proxy. Well, these proxies can be installed in the same farm or on web front ends in a totally different SharePoint farm, which is then going to allow us to have one farm act as like the service host for everyone else if we wanted to do it that way, or I can simply provide a search implementation for some of my other customers here. The other thing that's really nice about this is that I'm able to select which app servers I want my services to run on. So if I have 10 app servers on the back end, I can have 3 of them dedicated just for search. But if I needed to go through and to scale out and say, well, look, search is being heavily used in my environment, I want to add 2 more servers to it, I just fire up the search instance, the search service instance on 2 more of those servers, and they automatically become part of the rest of them. Very much like how when we load balance web front ends, we simply just spin up another web front end and add him to our load balancer, and he just goes through and adds him as another one of the options in the deployment story. All right. Now, this is just a little logical view of how the services are going to work. So you see here we've got 3 different farms. One of the farms is leveraging a search and a user profile service. That's farm 1. Farm 3, the purple farm, that's where we're going to be having, we have a search, an Excel, and a user profile services that are being leveraged. But you see here in farm 2, I've defined the managed metadata service inside of a completely separate farm, and I've enabled the other 2 farms, farm 1 and farm 3, to connect into the farm 2's managed metadata service. So you can see that it's going to be very easy for us to connect across farms. We'll see this when we get into some of the administration stuff in just a second. So how does this whole look from an architectural perspective? Where are all the different pieces of this? Well, you've already heard me say the word service a few times. Now, for the rest of this, just think, when I talk about service in the service architecture, I'm not talking about ASMX web services. I'm not talking about WCF web services. WCF does play a role in this, but when I talk about WCF services, I'll actually say WCF services, okay? So, the first thing I have here is a thing called the service. That's the logic or the actual program. These are the binaries, the DLL, that's going to contain all the work that's going to be done. So for instance, if I was going to provide like a calculation service that was going to provide simple like add and subtract methods, simple example, but just to kind of drive the point home, this is what's going to contain the add method and then the subtract method. I'm going to take that service and I'm going to deploy them to all my my application servers. I'm then going to go to individual app servers and I'm going to start an instance of that service on my app servers. And that's going to allow me to scale out and scale up how much my service is going to be used and how much it's going to be consumed. Now, when this happens, when I fire up a new instance of these guys, part of the code inside the service, the service instance, he's going to opt in and register himself with a particular load balancer. SharePoint provides a load balancer out of the box. It's a round-robin load balancer. So the first request comes in, goes to server A, second request goes to server C in this example, third request goes to server D, fourth request goes back to server 1. So it just kind of goes round-robin as requests come in. Once that's done, I then have to create a new service application. And this is very much like, these things don't live anywhere. Service application doesn't live anywhere in the farm. It doesn't live on app servers. It doesn't live on web front ends. Think about it very much the same way we think of like site collections. Where's the site collection? Well, it's really nowhere except for inside of a content database. The same thing is true for a service application. This is just like the configuration of my service application. This is going to tell it things like when I go through and do the administration of my service, where's the management page? Where's the properties page? When I click new, where's the new page, the wizard that somebody's supposed to walk through? Stuff like that. That's what it's going to go through and define. Where's a custom database that I may be storing data, that my instances need to store and access data? He knows where all that stuff is. I then have to go have these things called proxies. Now the service application proxies, they're traditionally going to live on the web front end. You're going to go install these on the web front end, and then you're going to go through and configure them to be linked up with the actual service itself. The way he's going to link up to the service is you're going to pass in a URL to the topology service. It's a topology. The topology service is a topology.svc, a WCF service. He's going to take a couple parameters. One parameter is going to be what's the service ID. What's the service ID that we're looking for? So my proxy, let's say I'm working with, say, the managed metadata service. I'm going to say, here's the ID of the managed metadata service. That proxy is going to go to the topology service, pass that value in. The topology service, which is a service application, but it's basically the backbone of the entire architecture. He's going to look inside the farm databases, the farm database, and he's going to say, go get a load balancer for my managed metadata service, and he's going to say which server is the one that I should be hitting now, or which one is going to get the next request. So let's say it picks server C on this example. It's going to go get a URI to that instance, but more specifically to a custom WCF service that I've had to create and deploy to my app servers that's going to implement the service program itself. So that's how I'm going to actually get into my service. All right, that's how I'm going to get into the service logic. He's going to hand back, the topology service is going to hand back the URI of where my custom WCF service is back to the proxy, and then the proxy is going to send the add command with the different add-ins in it, the two values that I want to add together. He's going to hand those back to that WCF service, which is then going to fire up my instance, my service instance, do the calculation, and then hand the results back to the proxy. So that's how all the communication is happening back and forth. The nice thing that you see here is that the service proxy doesn't have a clue where the different services instances are running. That's what's going to allow me to very easily connect one farm into the services of another farm. Now, this isn't something that's done by default. You have to go tell it that a service application that I've created, that either one of the out-of-the-box ones or a custom one, I have to publish it to other farms. So it's not automatically available to anybody that can get to it. The last piece of this are the consumers. These are the things that are going to use your service. These things could be web parts, they could be custom ASPX pages, they could be Silverlight controls. Whatever they are, they have to talk to the proxy. But the nice thing is, and you'll see from the code, is that they're going to be completely ignorant of the fact of where the service is actually running. They're just going to say, hey, I'm on the web front end. I need to go get a reference to the proxy that's installed on my web front end for this particular service. Now that I have that, here's the stuff I want you to go do. And the proxy says, well, I know where I'm supposed to go find out and go run this command. So I'll go pass that in. All right. One of the other things too that you can do is you can even create custom WCF services or ASMX services or whatever you want on your web front ends that are going to go through and talk to the proxies, so you can actually advertise some sort of a service offering to the world this way. So let's go and let's see what the new UI of this looks like inside of Central Administration. Okay, so in this demo, let's take a look at Central Administration and see where these services, these services are going to be managed and the different things that we can do with them. So if I come over here and I take a look at under Central Administration, underneath Application Management, you'll now see this link here talks about Service Applications. So I'm going to click on Manage Service Applications, and this is going to give me a list of all the service applications that have been set up and configured in my farm. So some of these, it all depends on the service itself, on what options we have available to us. But you can see here I have this little new link here where I can go through and create a brand new service that's been installed. And you'll see when we get to, we'll talk about creating custom services a little bit later, what's involved in doing that and how we go through and get something added to this list here. Now, let's say, for example, that I've gone through and I've created a service like on another farm somewhere, or one of my customers has created a service on another farm. One of the things that I would like to do is I would like to go through and connect my farm or my web front end to that farm. So I would go to the Central Administration site on my web front end. If it's not running on my web front end, I can do this usually through PowerShell. It just depends on the service. And I would come in here and I would say connect. And now what this is going to do, this is going to allow me to pick one of my proxies, one of my application proxies that have been installed on the server. And when I pick that proxy, it's going to say, okay, what's the URL of the topology service in that other farm here? So you can see here it's asking me for a bunch of stuff. We'll come back and we'll look at this, and I'll show you how to get this URL in just a minute, okay, on where you're going to go. So that's how we can go through and connect a proxy over to another farm, to a service running in another farm. If I take a look at some of these other services, you can see just some basic stuff here. So for instance, if I go to like the business data connectivity, or let's go to, let's look at the search one. So I'm going to pick search here, and you can see this is the search application that's running, and then this is the proxy that gets into the search application. All right. So I've got my search service application here, and then I've got a couple different options here up in the ribbon. So I've got my manage link here. What this is going to do is this usually takes me to the administration page for the service, and each service is going to be different. So this page can be different for each one. All right. we're not going to take any time here looking at search right now. We're just going to use that as an example. If I clicked on this link too, it would have taken me to the same managed link. So pick this one again. I can also say who's allowed to administer this service. And from this, I can just go through and pick an individual, do a search for the administrator, grab him, add him to it, and say what's he allowed to do, and he can do full control. I'm not going to do this right now because I don't want to mess with the search. I can also go through and inside my service, and you'll see where we have inside of our custom services, I can define my own custom permissions on what you can and can't do here. So I can add a new user and say what he is and is not allowed to do in the service, and then in custom code I can go through and manage that and do checks and demands and say make sure that you do have access to do this. I can also, depending on the service, have a properties page here, and this is going to allow me to set up certain things for my service. This is more kind of the configuration of the service. Like for the managed metadata service, he needs to know where's his database server and what's the database that contains all the stuff for the managed metadata, maybe what the failover server is, what app pool he's going to be running under, and then for this one, there's just another property of what's the content type hub, what site collection acts as the hub for all of my content types that I'm going to publish out. We'll talk about that when we get to the, we'll talk about that in the enterprise content management module. So let's say that I'm in some other farm and I want to provide a service to, I want to expose a service to let other farms connect into it. What I would do is I would pick the service and I would then say publish. Now after I've done that, I would then say, well, what kind of connection types am I going to allow to go through and to connect into them? So in this case, I say, well, I'll allow only HTTPS connections, and I say, yes, I want to go through and publish this guy, and then I want to go grab the URL here or of the actual service itself. So you can see here that it's pointing to the topology service in my farm, okay, in this farm here. I would take that URL and go back to the service. I would go back to the service, I go back to my other farm and create a new proxy. And when I'm creating the proxy, it's going to ask me what the URL is of the topology service. I would plug that in and I'd be good to go. And now the proxy would know how to talk to this farm, okay? So the next thing I wanted to show you is if I go back to application management here, if I look at configure service application associations, what this is showing me all the different web applications on the server, and then what service application proxies are using that bit, that web application is using. You can see here where you can create, you have these application proxy groups where I have a default group here, and I can pick what things are in the default group and what are not in the default group. This is, by default, it's going to usually contain all the services that are in the farm, but when I go to create a new web application, I could elect to not use all of this. So if I went back to say, let's go to manage web applications, and I want to create a new web application, you'll see at the bottom here, I have an option when this loads. You'll see I have an option here at the bottom where I can say, do I want to use the default group or do I want to create a custom group? And then this is where this a la carte bit I was talking about, where I want to use managed metadata, search, the state service and secure store, and maybe the application registry and business data catalog. Maybe I want to use all of those guys inside of this web application. So it's either default or custom. So that's everything there is to looking and managing the services. Obviously, each service is going to be a little bit different. So hopefully you have a little bit of an idea now of where these things are and how the architecture works.